Hello, welcome to another On This Day in Canadian Military History live reaction video. I'm going to be looking at a video from a channel that has almost 400,000 subscribers. I looked at it. They seem to focus on military history, and they said particularly World War II, so that's interesting. I don't think I've ever watched anything they've done before. It looks like they use that animation style to tell their stories and all of that, so that's cool. Different way to do it. No problem with that. I don't really know the channel at all. I was just looking at other stuff, getting prepped to do another one I wanted to do on a topic I've been thinking about a long time. This one popped up, and I've seen it before. I didn't give much mind just because of busyness and other things, but I've seen it before. So I think it's just about Canadians at war. It seems to focus on several individuals and just Canada First and Second World Wars. So we'll see what we've got. Again, know not much about it, so I'm watching it for the first time with you guys. So it'll be an interesting one to see, and I'll link it down below. Just give me a second here. So let's get into it.
Sorry, not sorry. While Canadians are nowadays subject to the stereotype of hockey-loving, maple syrup-chugging, overly polite potheads, their wartime stereotypes in the First and Second World Wars had their enemies trembling in their boots and making a hot mess in their trousers. It's as if when the Canadians hear the word war, their insatiable desire for maple syrup and Canadian beer turns into an insatiable desire for blood. In saying that, however, they didn't always rush enemy positions with bayonets, meat cleavers, and spiked clubs, but were some of the most well-trained and formidable soldiers on any front in any war. In this video, we're going to...
Okay, so just stopping it right there real quick. Best trained soldiers, not always. I mean, no army's ever the best trained all the time anywhere. That's impossible. But there is this perception that the Canadian troops were very well trained. In a lot of cases, they were, not denying that. But again, just kind of like a sweeping statement. Doesn't really quite fit for anyone, does it? Interesting use of photos, by the way, to begin with. I really like it.
To explore Canadian wartime reputation, keeping our scope focused on World War II and the heroic feats of individual Canadian soldiers therein.
Okay, so it looks like World War I's a build-up to the Second World War and the stories, I suppose, which is a very just a very good way of doing that. I think it's a really good idea because the two wars are inexplicably linked in Canada, especially. So it's a good idea. It's very intense opening here. Very intense. The front. Yeah, that's the name of the channel.
To get the puck sliding, let's move our scope quickly to the First World War,
I like that.
in which the Canadians laid the groundwork for their reputation as shock troopers.
Yeah,
mostly, the troops of the Canadian Corps were known for their savage raids on enemy trenches and their unwritten take no prisoner and kill the wounded policies.
Kind of.
Locked in a stalemate in opposing trenches.
Not really. I mean, obviously there was that occurred, not denying that fact by any means. What is interesting, though, is that wasn't obviously everything. Canadians took POWs just like every other army does. But for a long time, particularly post-war, this wasn't really the impression of the Canadian Corps, especially. Not that they were just seen as these elite shock troops. Right? There's literally books named after that and that kind of thing. But the bloodthirsty Canadian didn't really come up until much later, and then caused some controversy later on with the very well-known Tim Cook writing on this kind of thing. So it's really interesting how that develops, and maybe that can be talked about it another time.
The Canadians devised all manner of strategies and weaponry to flip the chessboard upside down and clean up the enemy pieces. Cutting through barbed wire, they crept upon them in the cover of night with painted faces, launching either savage, unforeshadowed raids or perking up their ears and eavesdropping on enemy plans. In said raids, the Canadians gorged their bayonets with blood and made good use of improvised melee weapons, paying little attention to attempts at surrender and skewering bandaged and unarmed men just the same as men on their feet with rifles.
Not really, but okay.
They even concocted an alchemist's shelf of homebrew explosives,
sort of
pipe bombs and jam jars loaded with nails
it did happen.
Powder. I think it's a safe bet to say that at least one grenade is made with a maple syrup jar. There are also tales of...
They wish. I mean, they didn't have maple syrup. They were using Canadian rations. I think it's just an interesting focusing on stereotypes again, which I do love maple syrup. Not going to deny it, but it's funny. I doubt it, only because they couldn't get it. I'm sure they wanted it, but probably couldn't get it because it had to be better than some of the, no offense, but British rations they were given were not the best at the time. And just to build that improvised explosives, that more comes from the beginning of the war, when there's not really specifically designed things for these kinds of roles, particularly with the abundance of grenades or the Mills bomb that comes later. So this is more of an early war thing, so it's not technically incorrect. It's just kind of skewing and muddling it a little bit.
Canadian troops using temporary truces, like on Christmas Day, as a chance to catch their enemy with his stockings on.
Not really.
Sending him grenades instead of Christmas ham, and bullets through the brain instead of season's greetings.
Not really. There's no real Christmas truces, to be honest.
It could be argued that Canadians were acting out of vengeance, but couldn't that argument be used to justify most atrocities in most wars?
Yeah.
Canadian Lieutenant R.C. Germain's letter home to his parents makes the revenge excuse about as clear as the sap from a freshly tapped maple tree. After losing half of my company there, we rushed them, and they had the nerve to throw up their hands and cry "Camarade."
Yeah,
all their
I've read this letter.
They got was a foot of cold steel, while I blew their brains out.
Yeah, I think this letter's been read a lot.
Despite being a little stab happy with enemy
to talk
soldiers,
about this kind of thing.
Canadian troops were known for being quite, as we contemporary folk have come to expect, polite to civilian population.
Not really. I mean, there's issues with the Canadians who go anywhere, particularly after the war. Not so much fun. I mean, there's numerous Canadian riots in Britain, so I don't know. We'll see if they get there, but I doubt it.
Before we have a look at Canadian reputation in World War II and some of its stories, it might pay to know about Canada's involvement in the war. Canada waited until the 10th of September 1939 to declare war in Germany because it didn't want to follow Britain like a Commonwealth sheep.
Kinda. I mean, that's not wrong per se. I wouldn't use that kind of language. I think that's loaded language, obviously. There's all kinds of reasons why. I mean, and this has come up a lot to me. They don't do it, because of reasons about Canadian independence and all of that, but they mobilized the same as everyone else before war broke out, technically, even with Britain declaring war. They mobilized before that, August. So, this is all just a technicality in a lot of ways. Canada's at war, more or less, the same time as everybody else.
It took Canada until the 11th of June 1940 to declare war on Italy and the 7th of December 1941 to declare it on Japan.
Okay, that's misrepresenting the Italian entrance into the war completely. They don't declare war and invade France until later, until basically the writing is on the wall with the German invasion. So to say they didn't do it until June 40, neither did anybody else. And then, of course, the Japanese declaration actually comes before most other countries, even the United States, because of all kinds of reasons. But of course, that's not until the Pearl Harbor attacks, and then the attacks specifically in Hong Kong, Canadian troops. So it's a bit weird.
Overall, about 10% of Canada's population fought for her and the Allies. This amounted to around 1,100,000 Canadians serving in the Canadian Army, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal Canadian Air Force. Of this 1,100,000, the majority were volunteers.
Yep.
Canadians fought in almost every theatre of World War II,
Yep.
notably in the defense of the United Kingdom,
Yep.
the Battle of Hong Kong,
Mhm.
the Dieppe Raid,
Yep.
the invasions of Sicily and Italy,
Yep.
the Normandy landings
Oh,
and
yeah.
the liberation of France, and the liberation of Belgium and the Netherlands.
Yep, and the occupation.
The Canadian
Germany.
Navy escorted Allied ships across the Atlantic and maintained a high presence in the Pacific Ocean.
Whoa.
And pilots from the Canadian Air Force flew under
Whoa,
the
okay, that's a reach. Of course, I love focusing on the Pacific, Canada especially, but that's a reach. Presence, I guess technically true, but that didn't mean much, particularly in protecting the coastline, which was never really under threat from the Japanese ever. I mean, if one sub surfaces and fires on a lighthouse, and I think misses, that's it. I mean, they're shooting, they do the same, the Japanese do the same thing to the U.S. West Coast. But there's no real threat. And most of the Royal Canadian Navy's effort is focused on the Atlantic by leaps and bounds. It's not even close.
of the British Royal Air Force. German submarines sunk Canadian naval and merchant vessels in the water of Canada and Newfoundland and attacked the loading pier at Bell Island.
Just like everybody
the
else.
Japanese also attacked the lighthouse on Vancouver Island though little else occurred in Canadian waters
Nothing.
or on mainland Canada.
Nothing.
Of the military operations in which Canadians...
The thing about mainland Canada, which is interesting and is a very rare part of the war that's known, is the balloon bombs that Japan sent across the Pacific. I mean, those were killing people up until the 70s. I think one blew up and killed somebody. They would just send them randomly, right? One made it as far east as Saskatchewan, maybe Manitoba. I can't remember exactly, but they were causing indiscriminate damage. The idea behind the Japanese for doing so was to set forest fires on the U.S. West Coast and draw out supplies that way. Trying to do this attritional thing with forest fires, but that's it really. Nothing else happens.
Bold, their ferocity and inventiveness stood out in the Battle of Ortona, the Normandy landings, and the liberation of Belgium and the Netherlands. Through the medieval streets of Ortona, Italy,
very well-known paintings of Ortona.
Room-to-room, hand-to-hand fighting, with the Germans eventually having to withdraw.
True.
Here, the Canadians coined the tactic mouse holding.
No, they did not.
Which is basically blowing holes in buildings to allow the passage.
They did not coin it. They did not invent it. It was done beforehand. It was in manuals before the war. They did not invent it. They just used it for the first time, I think, in the Commonwealth armies at this scale, and particularly in a well-known battle. I mean, Ortona was in the press, not just in Canada, but around the world. Because of the nature of the fighting, all of that stuff. It was called Little Stalingrad, so it had a lot of attention. So it's one of those things, it's not an invention per se, but using it on a wide scale for the first time really in the Commonwealth armies, as far as I know.
Infantry, rather than running into enemy bullets in the open. In the D-Day
Technically true.
The Canadians landed on Juno Beach,
yes.
The second most resisted beachhead besides Omaha. The Canadian...
Okay, I know other people have lots of trouble with saying these things about the beach. Sorry, they have issue when people talk about these things about the beaches, defenses and all of that kind of stuff. It's hard to tell. What does that mean exactly? Does that mean number of bunkers, number of troops within certain distance? Like, what does that mean? I'm not saying one or the other. I don't know what that means. Yeah, Juneau's full of concrete defenses, but so is Golden Sword. So again, I'm not sure the numbers. I don't know what you count. Do you count obstacles on the beach, obstacles in the water? I don't know what that means. It's kind of a more of a less meaningless statement that has an oceanal impact, which is unfortunate. But the rest so far, I guess just checking in is pretty good so far.
Canadians penetrated further inland than anyone else.
Not true, technically.
Some of the strongest units in the German military.
Not yet.
In Belgium and the Netherlands, the Canadians spent thousands and thousands of Canadian lives
True.
to drive the Germans back and get food to the starving civilian population.
Not connected necessarily, but yes.
They even shared rations with civilians
They did.
and gave them blankets.
Yep.
Some of the most intense combat here was in the Battle of Schelde.
Oh, yeah.
The Allies fought through flooded terrain against stiff German defenses for about a month.
They did.
This battle alone cost the Canadians more than 6,000 casualties.
A lot.
This latter triumph, particularly the part about getting food to the starving civilians, is certainly keeping with Canadian tendencies in the First World War, though the following atrocity paints a bit of a different picture.
Following atrocity?
Canadian Lieutenant Colonel Frederick E. Wiggle was shot dead on approach to the town of Friseute, Germany.
Okay.
And rumors spread
I know
it
where
was
this
a
is going.
civilian sniper from that town who shot him. Back on that revenge train, the Canadians burnt down the entire town, apparently moving its citizens onward before setting their homes on fire. It was discovered later that Wiggle was shot by German soldiers. Now, the intent of emphasizing Canadian brutality in World War I and mentioning the Friseute incident
Not
is
really
not
what
to
happened,
take
but-
away from Canadian bravery in either world conflict. Like I said before, Canadians were some of the most well-trained and formidable soldiers on any front in any war. And I think the best way to communicate that is to share some stories involving some of the most heroic Canadian soldiers in World War II.
Fair enough, I guess.
On the 14th of December 1943, Canadian Captain Paul Triquet and his company, supported by an armoured squadron, tried to cross the gully and take the Casa Paradi, a hamlet on the Orto Orsona lateral.
It's mostly a house.
Under heavy machine gun and mortar fire, Triquet ran around organising and inspiring what remained of his men.
It's true.
Saying, "There are enemy in front of us, behind us, and on our flanks. There is only one safe place.
Yep.
That is on the objective."
That's recorded several places.
Before charging forward and breaking through the enemy line.
Mm-hmm.
Triquet's company and the supporting tank squadron pushed right up to the edge of Casa Paradi, where he set up defences and fought off a tank-supported German counterattack with whatever weapons he could find.
Yep.
He held the defensive perimeter against superior numbers until the rest of the battalion came in and relieved the company. Leques's utter disregard of danger, his cheerfulness and tireless...
One thing interesting about this, I just want to point out, those photos are not from this action, from Triquet's actions at all. I mean, there are none. There was no unit there recording, like there was no film unit there. So none of those are there. I think that they should have noted that, particularly with those dramatic photos. Some of them literally look like training photos. Some of them I know from after the fact. They're pulling a tank out of the gully. That's not what happened at the time. That wouldn't have been a priority. So it's interesting that that's just not noted. I think it should have been, but that's a minor aside.
Devotion inspired his men, and his tactical skill and leadership facilitated the capture at a vital point on the Ortona-Osona lateral.
True. And Curry, of course. Big fan of him.
On the 18th of August 1944, Canadian Major David Vivian Curry was in command of a force of tanks, self-propelled anti-tank guns, and infantry.
Not right away, but
his
sure.
task was to block an escape route from the Falaise pockets in the village of Solembeau-sur-Diver, Normandy.
Yep.
Curry went in alone to scout German defences and to free the crew of 2 Allied tanks which were previously disabled.
Yep.
Under heavy
That
mortar
morning.
fire, he succeeded. The Germans then kept throwing counterattacks at Curry and his men until on the 20th, one final German counterattack was thwarted by Curry, costing the Germans some 2,900 casualties. Throughout these 3 days of intense combat, Curry displayed gallant conduct and a contempt of danger, and collected and inspired his men.
And these are photos from the fighting.
Said, "We knew at one stage that it was going to be a fight to the finish, but he was."
One thing that's not mentioned in the fighting part here is some of those troops that are trying to get through are not necessarily counterattacking per se. They're just trying to get out. A good number of them are just trying to run. So they wait till nighttime and just literally slip through the lines as best they can and get out. Some of them are on foot for a long time. They abandon their equipment and just run through the lines. Literally, it happens numerous times. And all kinds of stories from the fighting in the village town itself. It's so interesting to hear these stories about what's happening. Like they're literally feeling through the dark, and you can think there's accounts of the Canadians in the tanks hearing like the knocking and just feeling the tank and then yelling out Panzer and then just taking off. Like that happens multiple times.
Was so cool about it, it was impossible for us to get excited. Over the 3
It just
days,
sounds like Curry.
barely got an hour's sleep.
Yeah.
And when it was over, he fell asleep standing and then crashed to
He
the ground.
fell down, yeah.
Curry's courage and devotion to duty had a far-reaching effect on the successful outcome of the battle.
100%. These will be interesting. He might some of this is difficult to get right.
Also in Normandy, where he captured a German armored vehicle which held secret codes and lost an eye to a phosphorus grenade.
True.
He stayed in service, saying that he looked like a pirate.
You did say that.
However, it wasn't in Normandy where Leo earned his first distinguished conduct medal, but in the Netherlands in 1945.
Yep.
Actually, before we go there, Leo single-handedly captured 93 Germans in the Battle of Shell. When out on a solo reconnaissance mission in 1944. He escorted.
I don't know the primary documents of that one as well as I should, but again, that might have been conflated a bit. Again, it's hard to tell for sure how many numbers were actually taken by him personally and all the details. It may have been conflated, and I think it probably was.
All 93 of them back to his camp, where he would not accept a DCM because he considered the person awarding it to him to be incompetent. Back to 19.
Yeah, that person is Bernard Montgomery. Again, that's one that's speculated on that may have never said that. All this kind of stuff. Again, with anything to do with Miger, you have to take it all with a grain of salt with what the things he said and how they're presented in videos like that, which is interesting because this happens to pretty much any video about him. So it's still a story that's very muddled.
45 and the real DCM. After breaking his back, ribs, and both ankles when the car he was in was hit by a landmine, Leo went on a recon mission with a friend in the city of Zwolle. His friend was killed, so Major continued alone, capturing a German soldier, making the soldier take him to his officer, who was in a bar, and then telling that German officer that the Canadian artillery was going to shell and kill them all. Leo then ran through the city, firing his gun and lobbing grenades, fooling the Germans into thinking the Canadian army was invading.
That part again might be exaggerated. again, that might not have even happened. We don't know. It's hard to tell, right? Because these accounts, Niger passed away a long time ago. Things get inflated in wartime. It makes a good story for the internet and all kinds of things, right? So it might have been not so much like that. But he may have just taken prisoners. He may not have had to make the big show of it. But again, it's hard to know for sure.
All through the night, Major brought captured German troops back to his camp, resting in civilian houses whenever he needed to catch his breath. He then set a Gestapo HQ on fire and assaulted a Nazi SS HQ before meeting with members of the Dutch resistance and informing them that he had liberated the entire city by himself.
Again,
I've got to say, that last one is pure insanity. What an absolute machine. Overall, based on the available evidence at least, I think Canadians in World War II abandoned their unofficial take no prisoner and kill the wounded policies of World War I. Obviously, this is a generalization. It's
just not true either.
And the Flezoiter incident certainly demonstrates they were at least capable of unjust violence. Though there is no comparing the two.
Okay, I want to talk about that incident he mentions. It's not. Yeah, it's a war crime technically. I mean, they don't burn the town to the ground for no reason just because. That's, again, conjecture in a lot of ways. They use a lot of the building to fill in the roads that have been cratered to stop the advance. It's not right, or I'm not saying it's right, but that's not necessarily the whole story. And again, it's not just, and that's one incident in one town in Germany. I mean, that's not filling in all the details of how the Canadians fought against the Germans in the Second World War. They took so many prisoners. Look at fillets, thousands. I mean, it's not like this is a policy ever in the First World War too. That's just not true. There's so many photos of POWs all the time. It's just not a thing. It just doesn't exist. And it's another myth that we have about Canada and the World Wars, particularly the First World War.
Canadians to say the Germans, the Japanese, and the Soviets. As evinced by the stories of Paul Triqueux, David Curry, and Leo Major, Canadian courage and formidability was in no short supply, and I believe modern-day Canadians should be proud of how the Canadian military cleaned up their act after World War I.
That I don't agree with because it never happened.
A significant contribution to an Allied victory in the Second World
War. Both wars.
Anyways, guys, make sure you let me know your thoughts on Canada and some of the super soldier.
Okay, so that's the end of it. There's some ads and stuff, so I'm not going to show that. But the video is misrepresenting a bunch of stuff, which happens. I'm not critiquing that per se. It's just feeding into myths, which always bothers me as a historian, especially ones who focuses on myths in wartime. So that is something that kind of bugs me a little bit. But the rest of it's good. The Curry part was very well done. I mean, there's lots of documentation about Curry, and it looks like they used it. And same with Triqueux. It's very well documented. Major, the stories are crazy and hard to pin down and are conflated. The two incidences are conflated. Same with stuff that happened in Korea because he re-enlists, and it's just it's all very difficult to do and to do it well. It's a hard story to tell. But the biggest thing to take away for me is the whole take no unofficial take no prisoners attitude of the Canadian Corps, which was just not the case. And also saying that the Canadians, as right on, is that the Canadians did make a major contribution, particularly in Northwest Europe. But they did in the First World War too. The Canadian Corps is the tip of the spear, along with the Australians and other numerous divisions of the British Army that are used time and time again as the tip of the spear as in the push in the 100 days. So they did lead to the victory there as well. So that's not mentioned, unfortunately, in this video. So that would be my one big criticism. But overall, it's an interesting video. This channel has lots of viewers. This video is very well viewed, particularly for something about Canadians. It's full of stereotypes. Some are just funny, and all you can do is laugh. But that's it. So thanks for watching this one again. If you like the channel, please subscribe. If you haven't been here before, please do leave comments below, and I'll get working on something else. But check out the channel and see what we have. All kinds of different stuff on here. So thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.